What's the most awkward date you've ever been on? Story 1. I remember one where we both just ran out of things to say. It started off fine, but then about 15 minutes in, it felt like we were both trying way too hard to make conversation. I kept thinking of random topics, but she just kept nodding and offering one-word answers. At one point, we were just sitting there, sipping our drinks, staring awkwardly at the table. Story 2. Met this girl in Bumble, cute-looking Asian girl, about my age. We somehow matched. I rarely ever match. We talked for like a week and she wanted to go on a date. I said sure. First, when I checked, she lived 2 HRs away. Should have bounced then, but I had family around where she was, so I just said okay to an afternoon date thinking I'd hang with my cousin afterwards. Got to the movie theater all excited, finally saw her, went in for a hug or at least hello, and she just walked past me to the ticket stall. We had said we were watching Gran Turismo, but she just looked at the movies and pointed to the earliest one. Equalizer 3, LOL. Bought the tickets, popcorn, sodas, walked into the theater with just hi, and I realized she could barely speak English. She actually pulled the phone out to write her replies a couple of times. We sat down. Of course, she hated the movie. I had a blast, El Mao. And I'm just thinking, well, that's that. We'll split and she'll unmatch me, since we had zero communication. When the movie ends, we walk to the parking lot and I'm like, hey, it was nice to meet you. And she asked me to go eat. Well, I acquiesced. We got in the car and went to a Culver's out front. Only then did we talk a little, communication broken as can be, and she finally opened up a little. She just moved in for college from China, was super shy, had no friends, had no idea how to make friends, had some sort of faith crisis, hated the food, too greasy LOL. It was sad. She was super sheltered and was just having a huge culture shock. We drove around for a while later and she wanted to stop to watch a football game, but it was a kid's game. I thought it would be weird. We basically just drove in circles and chatted for a couple hours, and I just tried to give her advice on how to get used to the US and meeting people in college. She was clearly checked out by now, until I drove her back to the cinema parking lot. I called my cousin, but he was busy and I just said it. Went to the closest Buc-ee's for food and gas, and then the trek home. By the time I was eating my sandwich, she'd unmatched me. I deleted Bumble for the last time that day, LOL. Story 3. I was on one of my first ever dates at a coffee shop, blind date. The guy had nothing to say about anything. He was a university student going for mathematics. I asked about his studies and interests. He said he had nothing outside of that. He sometimes watches movies. I asked what kind of. He said movies from the 60s. Okay, oddly specific. He offered 1 to 2 word answers and asked me nothing. Then out of nowhere, he said, I look a lot like his brother's girlfriend. We mostly sat in silence. And when I left he kept walking with me, although I had clearly ended the date. I hopped on a bus and was prepared to get off at a wrong stop if he followed into the bus. It was so bizarre. Story 4. One time I went on this date with this girl from one of my college classes. She used to doodle in the margin of her notes, and that's something that I would frequently comment on during class. So, on the date, she brought a little portfolio of some of her drawings for me to look at. It's mostly full of anime, manga-esque pictures, but I think it looks good. So I tell her, wow, you are really artistic. Problem is, I have a lisp and cannot pronounce my R's, so it sounded like I said autistic. She quickly bailed on the date, to my utter befuddlement, and never sat next to me in class again. I still had no idea why she was so pissed off until I retold the story to my friend, and they immediately filled me in on the miscommunication. Story 5. Met this girl online. We talked for a few months, and then she decided to make the hour trip down to see me. It was the first date I'd been on in a long time, and the undiagnosed autism was strong in me. I was so awkward. At the end of the date, she was going to give me a hug, and I shook her hand. Unsurprisingly, I never talked to her again. But my story ended happily. I've gotten a diagnosis, become much better at reading social cues, and I've been in a great relationship for nearly 6 years now. Story 6. The guy started unloading his entire life history on me. I got to hear about how his mother died and how he was in hospital over Christmas, and how badly his work treated him. It went on for 3 hours, and not once did he ask a question about me or talk about anything else. I could have ended it sooner, but part of me wanted to see just how long it would continue for. Also, my very first boyfriend. Right after our first date, he wanted me to come and meet his mother because she wanted to talk about safe dating with us. I was 13. I didn't even want to have that conversation with my own parents, never mind someone else's. He wasn't my boyfriend after that. Story 7-2 comes to mind. We were on a date having a drink. She spotted 2 guys she barely knew from who knows where and invited them to our table and spent the next hour just talking to them about some festival they'd all been at. Then they invited us to a party where she again just spent the time hanging out with them, leaving me alone. I just left. When I later brought it up on text, she couldn't understand why I didn't want to go out again. Tinder date. She did not look like her photos, like at all. I scared her away by spending the date talking about my ex. Story 8. We met at a coffee shop, and while I was trying to have a conversation, they kept looking at their phone. Every few minutes, he'd check for texts or scroll through social media, and it just felt like he wasn't even really there. On top of that, the conversation didn't flow at all. It was like pulling teeth to get him to engage, and he didn't ask me any questions about myself. By the end of the date, I was just relieved to get out of there. Story 9. He took me to see The Hangover in theaters. This was his third time watching it. Should have been a red flag. Spent the whole movie quoting all the lines. Multiple people had to ask him to stop. We went to get ice cream later, and he told me he was a pathological liar. Story 10. Man. Going back probably 12 years. Met a girl on Tinder. Met for drinks, and she was legitimately 50 pounds heavier than her profile pictures. Whatever, still willing to hang and chat for a little. She proceeds to order 7 appetizers, eats every bite, doesn't offer me any. Gets up, says thanks, and just walks right out the door. Story 11. First date, blind date. We met on dating app, went great. Second date went awry. We went to his app in the city, and to no rhyme or reason, my eyes started nonstop tearing, and my brain/body had zero control of the tear ducts. This has never happened to me. I mean it, even to this day. I tried to play it cool as best as I could until things got frisky and my date started getting angry because I was ruining the mood after we really hit it off. We're headed for a home run, and he wasn't moving past not even second base. We even went on his rooftop terrace, and that seemed to help, but the second we walked back inside, my eyeballs hit the waterworks. This was the middle of winter cold blast in NYC, so hanging outside wasn't in the cards. Eventually, after just talking and nonstop eyes crying, he asked me to leave, and rightly so, because that was just awkward and I really wanted my eyes to stop tearing. Even worse, I got up as fast as I could and said, "Okay," thanked him for hosting the night and walked out that door, never looking back. I'm genuinely not mad that happened, and we never spoke, seen, or heard from each other since. Story 12. Mostly because of me, I used to be a drinker, and before this date, I had a 4-pack of beer for Dutch courage. The date was fine enough, I think. I used to be relatively okay at holding my liquor and being somewhat coherent. But then I bumped into someone I knew and, not recognizing social norms, loudly invited them to join us at the tiny table we had managed to rescue from the crowded bar. "Hey, so great to see you. You should join us. This is underscore, 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 underscore," and promptly forgot my date's name. So instead said my date, and rather than apologize or be mortified, just continued as if that was completely normal. Both parties were very awkward as it dragged on, and I think I walked her to the bus before getting even drunker on my own in my room. I was oblivious to the entire thing till many years later when I had a random flashback after getting sober. Still can't remember her name, but if you're reading this and it's you, I'm really sorry. I'm working through the steps, and you're owed amends. Story 13. While we were eating, instead of small talk, he made noises from horror movies and had me name the horror movie. It was actually really fun because I love horror movies, but super weird at the same time. I ended up ripping my jeans in half right up the seam of the ass when getting out of his car. That was a personal nightmare that I tried my best to hide with my purse while I went back into my house. We hung out a couple more times. He was a super weird yet harmless dude. There just wasn't enough there. Story 14. Went on a date with a lassie years ago who I met off Plenty of Fish. We really clicked messaging each other and she seemed cool, so I invited her to dinner. She must have said about 10 words during the whole dinner. When the waiter asked what we'd like to drink, she asked him if they had Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Think they had Pepsi, so she was like, no, just a lemonade then. I asked, is there much of a difference, and she totally bit my head off saying Pepsi gives her a headache. We ate in pretty much silence the rest of the meal with me trying to initiate conversation and getting one-word answers back. Afterwards, when I got home, she texted me saying she had the best time ever and how easy it was to talk to me, and she couldn't wait to do it again. Needless to say, we didn't meet again. Story 15. I went to a football game with my ex-girlfriend. I couldn't find her for like 10 minutes, all the while she watched me running around like a moron from the stands until I finally spotted her. She brought one of her friends I'd never met as well. I was too nervous by that point to say anything, and so was she apparently, because we didn't speak at all until the game was over and her friend left. We went behind the stadium area and started walking around the path, trying our best to converse as best one can in 9th grade. And some guy who used to bully me showed up. Apparently, he was a good friend of my girlfriend. She left me for a minute to go hug him and then talk to him about whatever. I didn't want to seem insecure, so I didn't say anything about it, but it felt off to me. Overall, the whole thing sucked big time. Story 16. I once went with a man I barely knew to the beach at night. He told me out of nowhere that he could do whatever he wanted with me, and no one would know because there was no one but us in that place. I felt so scared, but I was able to control it. I never saw him again, but I was left with the doubt that maybe he had done something to someone before or after what happened to me. I will never know. Story 17. My friend invited me out to have drinks. I got to the bar and he wasn't there, but one of his GF's friends was. I said hi because we knew each other and realized after radio silence from my friend that this was a blind date orchestrated by his GF. I had already rejected this girl twice. She was nice, but I was not attracted to her at all. Story 18. Unfortunately, I had two. Chris, met online. Oh, Cupid. Banter was great via text. Sparks were flying. We met up at a steakhouse because they had great cheese fries. I arrived first, and by pure surprise, an old male coworker of mine was the host. Chris arrived just in time to see me talking about the old office with the host. It was dramatic, I admit, because the place had shut down due to boss's illegal activity I didn't know about, and his mood dive bombed. I don't know if it was because he saw me speaking to another man, or if he thought I set him up somehow since I picked the restaurant and maybe he felt like I knew everyone there and he'd be watched. I don't know what it was. But once we were sat at the booth, he leaned against the side wall of the booth bench, crossed his arms over his chest, put one leg up on the bench and dangled his foot, and then wouldn't look at me the entire date, just pouted and stared at his own shoe. Made a point to disagree with everything I tried to say. Cheese fries were good. Kevin. Also met online. Okay, Cupid. Got dinner and a movie with him. The movie was Seventh Son, which if you don't know how much the movie sucks, it's because you haven't seen it. He also worked at the very theater we saw it in. His recliner didn't recline as smoothly as he expected, so he took it upon himself to flip the whole chair over too with the mechanics and the plugs, and everyone got a nice little show. Then over dinner, as soon as we ordered the food, he tells me that he was talking to his best friend about me because he was excited to meet me. And turns out his friend was another guy I was also talking to and was also going on a date with the same week. So what I panicked might turn into a confrontation turned into him saying that he was actually talking to multiple people as well and was more interested in another girl than he was in me, but he didn't want to be an asshole for canceling our date. Tell daughter, date with a man who refused to make eye contact. On another date with a man off Occupid who discovered I was also talking to his best friend on Occupid, but that was okay because he was also talking to other women and liked her better than me. Story 19. She took me to a bar that has 100s of board games. You pick a game from a menu, and the server tells you about it, how to play, etc. Seemed like a really cool idea and a great first date place. We get there, and from the get-go, the hostess seems really dismissive of us. The server isn't rude, but definitely not friendly. I'm kind of bummed, because it's the kind of place that I'd love to come back to. The date went fine otherwise. Later, we meet up with her friends to grab a drink. I get introduced to them and they're super nice. They ask about our date, and I tell them about the place we went to and how it was a neat idea, but the service was not great. They look at my date and say, "Oh no, Ashley, you didn't." I'm confused, so I ask what's up. They explain that the owner of that bar is my date's ex-BF, and she's had a hard time getting over him. The staff knew who she was and what she was doing, and obviously didn't give us good service. Story 20. A million years ago, before the internet was big, people ran things called BBSEs out of their houses. So kind of like a local message board and chat room people found out about through word of mouth. I started talking to a girl on there, and sight unseen, we decided to meet up. I guess it was a date, but when I met her, I realized I didn't find her that attractive. We watched a movie and talked for a bit and then parted ways. It wasn't that bad, but just felt weird to realize immediately I wasn't interested, but then go through with it. Story 21. I went on a date once with a girl who seemed fixated on how we were a bad match because I am vegan, how she could never be vegan because I love food too much, how her dad would disown her if she became vegan, how her best friend said coming on this date was a bad idea because it was with a vegan. In fairness, the friend was right because the subject of my veganism didn't make a particularly engaging conversation. Then she texted me the next day complaining that the restaurant had given her food poisoning. Story 22. A girl I had recently met wanted to go see Rocky Horror around Halloween. I was in college and living in a pretty big college town at the time, but grew up in Podunk nowhere, so I'd never even heard of Rocky Horror, much less what a theater experience would be like. Plus, I was pretty reserved. Generally, movies were good first dates for me back then, as it provided time to kind of just build comfort being around each other. So we went, and it was something. If you haven't been to one, I don't want to spoil it, but let's just say that I will never forget being on a first date surrounded by 200 folks running around in circles in their underwear. Story 23. My cousin set me up on a blind date with Pablo Escobar's niece, red flag #1. My date drove us to the restaurant and almost got us killed because she drove like a maniac. At the restaurant, she proceeds to tell me everything she wants to order. Okay, cool. When the waitress came to our table and asked my date what she wanted, She responded with, "Oh, I don't talk to the help," and made me order for her. Needless to say, that was the first and last date. Story 24. This was a second date after the owner of the brewery we were at sat at our table for 45 minutes and gave us marriage advice on our first date. She said she wanted to take me to a dance class. I'm totally down for this, but she wouldn't tell me what style of dance. I race home from work. I worked outside and was often sweaty, showered, changed into decent-looking clothing for going dancing in a bar/restaurant. I'm thinking it's like salsa night somewhere or something. I show up to the address, and it's a Y gym. It was an upbeat exercise class that used dance. Everyone was in workout clothing. I had to lie and say I just got off work, which is why I was dressed in a collar and nice shoes. My actual work clothes would have been more appropriate. She didn't talk to me the whole class, and her friend had to convince her to walk with me through the parking lot afterwards. It was so uncomfortable. I had a great time, and the people in the class loved me. I was good at it. I'm a musician and have rhythm and have taken dance classes before. But if you're going to invite someone to a dance class and not tell them what style, at least tell them it's a workout class and not at a typical date spot. Story 25. First date when I was 15. She looked very different to her social media, would only talk to respond to questions, was an incredibly awkward walk around the park. I said I had to get going, but she carried on walking with me. I told her she didn't need to walk me home, but she insisted it was fine. I got back and she followed me inside. I said I needed to go as my mom would be back with shopping. I'd have to help her unpack, but she said she could help. I panicked and made up some story about needing to go to the post office and walked her there. At which point I made it very clear I was going to walk back home alone and the date was over. A few hours later, I get a text saying she'd had an amazing time and wishes she'd kissed me, along with maybe 30 unsolicited pictures of her boobs. I told her I wasn't ready for a relationship and blocked her. Never saw her again. Story 26. She was a conspiration adept in the days prior to the pandemic. She was wild and beautiful, but in the end I went for Donna alone, as I could not even imagine spending the evening or night listening to her rambling. Apart from wild theories, she was also convinced Trump was the president of France, Trudeau the one of the US. As I thought she was pulling my leg, I mentioned Sarkozy. She goes on about how he's up healthcare here in Quebec. This was 2017. We live in Montreal. She was an educated woman with a great job. Story 27. Not sure if this counts since we didn't actually make it on the date, but I had met a guy in a dating website back 20 years ago. I was very picky, and after chatting with them via the dating site, rarely ended up giving my number. Well, this one guy made it that far. He called to set up our date and proceeded to straight out ask me if after dinner he would be able to come back to my place for the night because he's basically homeless and has nowhere to go. That received a prompt, no, and we won't be going on a date, but best of luck to you. He got angry and started yelling in the phone, so I hung up and blocked him. About a month or so later, I get this call from a number I didn't know. Caller ID said the name was some hospital. Worried someone I knew was hurt, I answered, and it was that guy calling me from a mental hospital because he said he went crazy due to me refusing to go on a date with him. He said my number is the only number he has listed in his file. I was in shock. He tried calling me another time, and then I blocked the hospital number, dodged a major psycho bullet. Story 28. The first date I went on with my wife was awkward. I'm older than her by 3 years, which now at 33 and 31 sounds fine. But when we started dating at 19 and 16, not so much. We met in high school my senior year, and she was a year ahead, so at first I didn't know she was younger by 3 years. I thought at most 2. Anyway, her mom came out and greeted me when I came to pick her up and was very standoffish. She was concerned. Elle and I didn't know why. Her daughter was the bad influence on me, if anything. It was the age gap and nothing more. I had met her mom a couple of times because we were both in band, how we met, and my mill was a band chaperone that went to games and competitions. It's not like when we started dating, we were strangers, and I was prowling my alma mater for fresh meat. We had band camp, laugh if you will, but it's real and fun, for 12 hours a day, Monday through Friday, the summer before my senior year. Obviously, we interacted a bunch, always flirting and stuff. She's smoking hot, and apparently I was good-looking enough for her to flirt back. Our first date was weird. We went and got a bite to eat and see a movie. She was silent the whole time we ate. I kept trying to get her to talk, and she wouldn't. We were both nervous, obviously. This was a new thing for both of us. This wasn't going out with our respective groups to get food. This was a date with romantic undertones. So we ate in silence. Super awkward. Then we went to a movie, which was good because you're supposed to be silent. After the movie, I still could not get her to open up. I figured, oh crap, she must be having a bad time. I blew this. I went and dropped her off a lot earlier than I had planned. I figured after the movie we could chill and talk and hang out until the last possible minute she had to be home. When I dropped her off, I walked her to the door and said goodnight. I leaned and went for her cheek, knowing a mouth kiss was not warranted, gave her a peck on the cheek, and she gave me this look. Again, I was like, oh, I misread this whole situation. Now that I know my wife and have been with her for 14 years, I know that look very well. That's not what I wanted. Nowadays, I get that look in a negative light because I'm a pain in her gigantic ass. But back then, apparently, she wanted to make out on her front porch. When we talk about it now, she said I was so charming and charismatic and that she didn't want to talk because she enjoyed listening to me talk. Super weird, but I love her. Oh, and her mom did warm up to me eventually. Our second date went much better, and I misread signals on that one too. Long story short, she took off her top and bra while we were making out in a dark, secluded spot I had parked at in my truck, and we did not have. Had on the third date, but she still makes fun of me for the second date 14 years later. We'll drive by the place I had parked, and she'll say, hey, remember that time I threw myself at you and started undressing, and you didn't seal the deal? Yes, I remember. I'm reminded often. Story 29. Met a guy online during lockdown who eventually admitted after chatting for 3 weeks that he was bipolar. Okay, I thought, researched it plenty, and I was still happy to meet. We arranged to meet at a nice restaurant as soon as lockdown lifted, but as soon as I met him, I realized things were off. He'd obviously hit a manic phase and proceeded to try and climb all over me in the restaurant, which was mortifying, trying to kiss me constantly. Then we went to the beach and he went completely cold, which confused the hell out of me. Went for a drink at a nearby pub, and back to the earlier behavior. I still liked the guy and could see the reasons behind his behavior. But then he started saying, why would you like anyone like me? It was very difficult to deal with. And despite me saying I'd see him again, he disappeared and ghosted me not long after that. Story 30. Went out on the first date with this freshman in college, treated me to a nice restaurant, spoiled me like a baby and told me it was his birthday before dropping me off. I felt really bad about it that I bought a cake for him next school day as a surprise, only to find out he's also celebrating his birthday again with his girlfriend. His girlfriend literally threw the cake to his face while I watched in silence. Story 31. So, middle school. I finally worked up the nerve to ask out this girl I liked, and we somehow agreed to meet at the mall food court. But it was so awkward that I'm pretty sure the employees there could feel it. We got pizza, sat down, and just stared at each other, chewing. Every question I asked, she'd answer with a single word like, yeah, or nope. Then I panicked and tried to crack a joke about how the pizza was more interesting than I was, but she just kind of nodded. I think I sat in silence for like 10 minutes praying for the courage to fake a stomach ache. Eventually, her mom came to pick her up, and we never talked again. Story 32. I once went on a coffee date where the other person spent the entire time talking about their ex, like the entire time. It felt less like a date and more like a therapy session I didn't sign up for. The cherry on top, they texted me later saying, this was so great, I feel so much better now. Safe to say, there wasn't a second date. Story 33. Ooh, I have a good one for this, buckle up. So I meet this girl through friends in my mid-20s. They would always explain to me that she's a bit different, quirky, if you will, but she's gorgeous and funny, and we'd be great together, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, we get connected on the phone, and within a couple weeks, we can talk for hours at a time. I was traveling a ton for work, but our schedules finally line up and we decide to get dinner. We go to a really nice steakhouse that my buddy is a server at and sit in his section. We get cocktails and are chatting and it's going really well. My friend comes over and starts to tell us the specials and I hear meow very faintly. He kind of stops mid-sentence and looks at me. He definitely heard it as well. A few seconds go by, no more sounds, so he continues with his pitch. Then an unmistakable high-pitched meow comes from somewhere very close by, and I was like, is there an ink-cat in this restaurant? He and I start looking all around, and I look across the table, and she is staring at me looking pretty distressed and says, I swear I'm not a crazy cat lady. She then grabs her big purse and opens it to reveal a kitten. Nope. I was like, yeah, this isn't going to work. She then explains she went through a trauma not long ago, and had gotten a kitten to help with the anxiety and fear she had been experiencing. She brought the little thing on our date because she was so nervous she almost canceled, but having him there made her feel better. Well, needless to say, the manager told us the cat couldn't be in there, so we left and went back to her place where I made us dinner instead. The little kitty's name is Koi. He's now almost 20 years old and sleeps with our kids at night. BTW, she's a liar. She's absolutely a crazy cat lady that I love more than anything in this world. Story 34. I got fixed up on a blind date by coworkers and figured, what the hell, why not? She wanted to meet at the restaurant, which was fine with me. As we ate, I barely got a word in as she was on a nonstop rant about her ex-husband, how much men suck, and how she hates it when guys say they're going to call and never do. I decided to just ride it out and enjoy my food as much as I can. At the end of the meal, we walked out to the parking lot and were about to part ways to head to our individual cars when I cheerfully told her, "Well, I don't think this worked out at all. I won't be calling you again." She laughed, I guess thinking I was joking, so I added, "Have a good life. I'm never going to see you again." And then I never did. Story 35. One time, we went to a fancy restaurant, and halfway through the meal, I realized I had spinach stuck in my teeth. He didn't say a word about it the entire time, but he kept looking at my mouth with this weird expression. I only noticed after I got home and looked in the mirror. I was so embarrassed. Story 36 I won't go into too much detail, too long a story. However, long story short, I met up with a girl to discuss a job position at her place of work. We had a few drinks and a laugh, and I left with the details of the company. I got home to a message from her that read, "It was nice seeing you today, but I get the feeling you don't like me. I would still like to remain friends, though." Turns out she thought it was a date. I didn't have the heart to tell her otherwise, so I just agreed that we should remain friends. Story 37. I was the presenter during a live event during the pandemic. During the broadcast, a girl found me on Tinder. She started sending a bunch of messages and looked up my address. She decided to go to my home and write a declaration of love on a roll of toilet paper and hang it on my door. She later apologized about that and said it was a drunken dare from her friends who watched the event together. She was also kind of cute and lived right next to me, so I bought that story. Ended up going on a date with her, and no, she was definitely crazy. And she told me about her family. That was also clearly crazy. I was just sitting there hoping she would leave me alone if I never wrote to her again. Story 38. She refused to talk to me beyond yes and no answers. None of the typical conversation starters worked. I asked what she was doing the upcoming 3-day weekend. She said she was going to St. Louis with some friends. When I told her that sounded fun and asked what she was doing, she just shrugged. I asked if she had ever been, and she said no. And then there was silence. At one point, I asked her hobbies, and she just gave me a list of 2. 3 things followed by silence. Asked about her family and told me she had one brother, and then silence. Asked her what her favorite foods, bands, places to go, things to do, etc. were. All I got was brief lists followed by silence. I don't think she asked me a single question all night or even spoke a sentence to me that wasn't prompted by me. It was very awkward. Then afterward, I complained to the mutual friend who had set us up, and apparently she told the mutual friend that the date was amazing and she couldn't wait to go out again. We did not go out again. Story 39. This woman apparently liked the cut of my jib and asked me out at my job. She was a customer. The next week, we are out on a date, and she is impossible to get to say anything. Also, we went to a movie, and she had ketchup packets in her purse that she put on popcorn. I mean, that was so nasty. I'd probably be Donezzo anyway. Then after the movie, when we were kind of halfway talking in the parking lot, she took a phone call speaking another language for like 10 minutes. I even interrupted her asking if everything was okay and if she just wanted me to drive her back to her car. Met at restaurant, took my car to theater. Was so weird, she said it was her friend from Kenya whose husband just left them. Which I guess is fine, but we were 5 minutes from the restaurant. I could have driven her back easily, and then she could have had that talk. She did reach out to me again, but I don't think I responded. I tried to think of something to say and then just went on with my life. Story 40. A former coworker set me up with one of her friends, thinking we would get along. We all decided to meet at a club. She spent the entire evening telling me how she misses her ex-boyfriend, telling me what makes him a great guy, and asking suggestions on how to get back with him. And we concluded with her hugging me goodbye and thanking me for my advice, and that she's going to her ex's home to get back with him. Thank God we never exchanged phone numbers. Story 41. Actually, probably a recent date with my wife. No, it was not awkward between us. We always have wonderful discussions and fun enjoying dinner. It was awkward because halfway through, a guy sat at the table next to us. He came alone and was waiting for his date for a long time. She did eventually show up. He talked briefly with us while waiting, which is no big deal, and then said, "I see your food is out, enjoy," but then literally kept interrupting us to ask us more questions. Nothing personal or creepy, just general, "You from around here? And have you been to ____ stuff?" We'd answer and then try to go back to enjoying ourselves, but he just kept doing it. Eventually, his date showed up and he left us alone. But the fact that he couldn't get the hint after we told him we were celebrating one of our birthdays, we are parents having a kid-free evening, we kept trying to keep getting back to our own personal conversation, etc., was just getting frustrating. It was a good 30 minutes of him waiting and doing this. Story 42. Once went on a date with a guy that would not shut up about his sister. Not just that he admired her, but how much he loved her and how gorgeous she was. He mentioned how hot she was several times and continued to talk about her in a weirdly romantic tone the entire, though short because I ended it quickly, date. It felt like some cringy joke, and I'm still not convinced that it wasn't. Story 43. He snapped his fingers at the waiter, who was a fellow student that we both knew from class. It wasn't a joke. I wanted to disappear, but he drove. There had been other things I'd overlooked, but that was the final straw, and I knew I couldn't date someone so disrespectful. I broke up with him that weekend. We'd been dating a few months, and when I saw my classmate next, I told him I'd ended it, and he high-fived me LOL. Story 44. Went out with a guy I matched with on Bumble once. He was condescending, but worse, he talked about how his roommate almost got arrested for about half of the date. His roommate was dating my friend at the time. Needless to say, I didn't reach out for another date and stopped talking to him. However, that didn't stop him from coming uninvited to my Halloween party 6 months later, after that friend was talking about her plans that weekend, and he invited himself. Story 45. I had been talking to a girl I met on a dating app for a bit, and we finally decided to meet up at a bar. Shortly beforehand, she hits me up saying that her friend was stuck downtown with nowhere to really go, so she was going to join us. I didn't think too much of it until she revealed that her friend knew me. Turns out her friend was the hiring manager of a temp agency that I had just walked out on a few weeks prior. She tried to play it off like it was all good, but it was clearly not all good LOL. I lasted less than one drink before the tension was too awkward and made up some excuse to leave. Story 46. My friend introduced me to a guy, and we went out on a dinner date. He was 1 hour late, and my God, I would have left if not that he's my friend's friend. Strangely, he didn't order any food to eat and stared at me eating. It was awkward as hell. I waited for him before ordering my dinner out of politeness. I obviously paid for the bill since I was the only one who ate. To top off this dumpster fire of a date, he then tried to sell me insurance policies. It was a don't walk, run situation, and I told him my Uber ride had arrived and fled. P.S. Yes, my friend was mortified when she found out what happened. Story 47. Back in the dating website days, Plenty of Fish, kind of relevant, went on a date with a girl. Met at the restaurant. Waitress turned out to be another girl I was chatting to on the site a bit. After ordering food, girl almost immediately starts a spiel about how she has undying love for me and that I quote, "I caught you, therefore you are mine." Cue me being very much aware that we are still waiting on starters. The rest of the time there was just as awkward, and after she wanted to go to the fun fair, lied, said I was busy, but offered her a lift home as her friend dropped her off. As an aside, before I could get a date with the waitress by some happenstance, she started going out with one of my friends, still friends, but I'm married now anyway. Story 48. I went out clubbing on Halloween night and met a nursing student dressed up as a firefighter. We hung out for a few hours, had a good time, caught a little bit of secondhand mace, and agreed to meet again. The date was a disaster. The only thing she talked about was nursing. My only experience in the medical field was secondhand from my mother, who happened to be a nurse, so it seemed like I was talking about my mother all night. There was no second date. Story 49. When I was around 20, I went on a date, met up at a mall with a guy. As soon as I was close to him, I smelled him. I'm talking BO that was unlike I'd been around before. I didn't want to immediately react, so I toughed it out for a bit. He suggested an arcade-type place, and I agreed, hoping to keep some distance. The moment he wasn't paying attention, I took off. Story 50. I once took a girl to a fancy restaurant where I accidentally slipped and spilled the entire bottle of red wine on her white dress. As I timidly offered napkins to staunch the flow of embarrassment, she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Good thing I wanted a baby car stain relief graphic design on this." In that moment, it became the best, worst evening of my life, proving that moments of tension can birth the most absurd, meme-worthy memories together. Story 51 went out to eat with this guy, and when it was time to pay, he pulled out his wallet and it was empty. LOL, come to find out he was living in a shelter and used me for a free meal. We talked for a bit after that, and I told him he could have told me the truth. I didn't diss him or anything, I just stopped talking to him. Story 52. Spent my last dime on a bouquet of roses for a first date, and while we walked together, she dismantled it and gave 5 roses to random people walking by, one by one without a word. I was so shocked I didn't ask anything, but we didn't go out on a second date. Story 53. In the late 90s in my hometown, hookah bars were a trend. The date was going well. We had finished dinner and were walking around downtown when I saw one. I said, "Hey, do you want to share a hookah?" She laughed nervously and said, "Seriously?" I was like, "Yeah, why not?" She demanded I take her home. The walk back to my car was super awkward. When we got there, I said that I was sorry for the suggestion, but I thought she was a smoker, so it would be okay. She said, "Why would you think me smoking means I'd want to share a hooker with you?" I paused for a second and said, "A hookah is one of those Arabic water pipes that you smoke tobacco out of. Did you think I was asking you to share a prostitute?" More awkwardness ensued as we sorted out the misunderstanding, but we muddled through and the date ended on a good note. We dated for a few weeks, but never did share a hookah. Story 54. I told him I was at the train stop we decided to meet at, and I see him sprint from across the street. He tried to hold my hand while crossing the street. BC. He has trauma from being hit by a car. He lied about making a reservation, so we headed to a coffee shop where I'm over it, but still didn't leave. He then says, "Hey, I don't think this will work out." I'm relieved. BC. I agree. And then he proceeds to tell me this was all an experiment just to see how far women would go from all the apps. This is my last strike, so I start walking out and he tries to kiss me and I never ran faster.